All right, moving on from the mouth into the stomach and small intestine. The stomach is going to be responsible for storing food, starting the digestion of proteins, and controlling the movement of food into the small intestine, where those nutrients could eventually be absorbed. The stomach itself does not absorb nutrients. However, it does absorb alcohol because alcohol is fat soluble and it can pass through cell membranes very easily. This is why alcohol is so quickly acting or acts so fast. It's because it's actually absorbed into the bloodstream from the lining of the stomach. Aspirin can also be absorbed in the stomach into the body, but this is why most drugs take 30 minutes. Things like Tylenol, things like ibuprofen take a while to react or take a while to kick in because it has to pass through your digestive system before it can be pass through your stomach before it can be absorbed into your cardiovascular system, where it can be carried throughout the body to wherever it needs. There are 3 layers of muscle in the muscularis layer instead of 2, which helps in the mechanical digestion. There's circular, longitudinal, and a 3rd oblique layer. Here, and I'll show you a little bit what that looks like. So here we have these 3 different layers of muscle, and if you look at them, the striations of the muscle go 3 different directions, meaning that the stomach has the ability to squish and squeeze and move in multiple ways in order to help physically break down that food. The mucosa of the innermost layer of the stomach has very deep folds called rugae. The mucosa also has gastric pits inside of these rugae, which contain gastric glands. Those gastric glands secrete gastric juice, which contains pepsin. Pepsin helps digest proteins. It's an enzyme that is found inside of your gastric juices that helps break down proteins into their individual amino acids. It also contains hydrochloric acid with a pH of about 2. Now, the fantastic thing about the hydrochloric acid, the reason our stomach produces the gastric juice with such low acidity, with such a low pH, very high acidity, is that it kills bacteria and activates pepsin. So it can kill any bacteria, any harmful pathogens that you may ingest, but it also activates that pepsin. Pepsin is an enzyme with an optimal pH of around 2. And so it'll activate that pepsin and allow it to work better to break down those proteins. Normally, the stomach is going to empty in about 2 to 6 hours. And when it does empty, chyme, a mixture of food and gastric juice, is going to pass out of the stomach through the pyloric sphincter. Up here, we have the lower gastrointestinal sphincter, gastroesophageal sphincter. It's going to separate the lower esophagus and the top of the stomach. But then down here at the very bottom of the stomach, we have the pyloric sphincter. The pyloric sphincter only allows a small amount of chyme to enter the small intestine at any given time. This is to help prevent any sort of overwhelming damage to the small intestine, but it also allows the food to be absorbed more sufficiently because we're going to be breaking down only small portions of it at a time. Heartburn is when the lining of the stomach, or the lining of the esophagus, is thinner than the lining of the stomach. You can see there's much less protection up here. If chyme enters the esophagus, so if we sort of get a backwash up the esophagus, it's going to produce a burning sensation. This can be caused by pregnancy when there's just physically less room for the stomach, and so it's getting pushed back out every time the pyloric sphincter opens. It can also be caused by excess fat pushing on the stomach. There is also gastroesophageal reflux disease, GERD. This is simply known as chronic heartburn, where the muscles of the lower esophageal sphincter are simply weak and maybe don't close all the way, which allows or causes a little bit of backwash up into the esophagus. Digestion is ultimately going to be completed in the small intestine. The small intestine contains or works with the pancreas. The pancreas is going to secrete digestive enzymes through a duct into the duodenum. The duodenum is going to be the earliest portions of the small intestine. once inside of the small intestine, pancreatic amylase, which is again produced by the pancreas and secreted into the duodenum, is going to digest carbohydrates. So we have salivary amylase found up in the mouth that's going to break down those carbohydrates. We also have pancreatic amylase, which is going to be secreted by the pancreas and involved in the digestion of carbohydrates in the small intestine. Trypsin is also going to be produced by our pancreas and secreted into the duodenum. It's going to digest proteins, and so it's a protease because it helps break down those proteins. Protease is just a class of enzymes that digest proteins. Pancreatic juice contains sodium bicarbonate, which neutralizes the acidic chyme. Now, there's going to be another duct that brings bile from the liver and the gallbladder into the duodenum. That bile is going to be responsible for emulsifying fat. So emulsifying fat is going to be breaking it down into its smaller portions so that it can then be, so that way it becomes water soluble. Mechanical digestion causes those fat droplets to disperse in water to expose more of it to lipase. Lipase, also produced by the pancreas, is going to hydrolyze those fats into glycerol and fatty acids. So the small intestine, like we said, it is responsible for chemical digestion through all of those different digestive enzymes, most of which come from the pancreas. It's going to be responsible for the complete breakdown of carbohydrates, proteins, fats, and nucleic acids. If you remember, our carbohydrate digestion started in the mouth with salivary amylase. Our protein digestion began in the stomach. With our pepsin. So that was back here in our stomach. And then we finish up our digestion of all of those with trypsin, which digesting the remainder of those proteins, pancreatic amylase digesting those carbohydrates, and bile to break down those lipids. Once we have broken down our food, we're going to see that absorption occurs in the small intestine. So we do have our chemical digestion. We finish breaking down those polymers into their monomers. Once they're broken down into their monomer form, we can then begin the absorption. The small intestine is going to be our primary site of absorption of nutrients into the bloodstream. This is where we're absorbing those monosaccharides, amino acids, fatty acids, water, ions, vitamins, minerals. All of those are going to be taken up into the bloodstream in the small intestine. The way that we do this is with the actual shape and structure of the small intestine. So here's a larger section of the small intestine. Underneath the microscope, you can see that the inner lining, the mucosal membrane layer, so that'll be the innermost layer, is going to contain finger-like projections called villi. That'll be these little structures right here. The cells that cover the villi have microvilli. So if you were to take a look at a cross-section of one of these villi and look at it underneath the microscope, you're going to see microvilli, so even smaller finger-like projections coming off of each one of those individual cells. They give the villi sort of a fuzzy brush type of border. The brush border enzymes are going to be responsible for completing that digestion. These two structures, both the villi and the microvilli, are going to ultimately increase the surface area of the small intestine for the absorption of nutrients. So it always comes down to the absorption, always comes down to that surface area to volume ratio. So here is a villi, and up close you can see the microvilli of the individual cells found on the villi. The nutrients are going to be absorbed into the villi, which contain blood capillaries. So here's a blood capillary down below, and small lymphatic capillaries called lacteals. Now, monosaccharides and amino acids are going to enter the blood capillaries of the villus. The glycerol and fatty acids will form lipoprotein droplets called chylomicrons, which can then enter the lacteal. So we're going to have the absorption of our proteins and carbohydrates into the bloodstream, and we'll have our absorption of our fat globules into the lacteal. Once those nutrients are absorbed, they're eventually going to be carried to all of the cells of the body through the blood. So here is a wonderful diagram, or a table. So I want you to spend just a little bit of time with this table. this table is going to tell you where the major digestive enzymes are located and what they break down. And I would like you to know this. I would like you to know, generally speaking, where digestion begins for each one of these. So carbohydrate digestion begins in the mouth with salivary amylase. It does continue in the small intestine with pancreatic amylase, maltase, and lactase. And so this is how we are going to be breaking down our carbohydrates into their various components so that way they can be absorbed into the bloodstream. The major digestive enzymes of the protein are going to begin inside of the stomach. So I do want you to know where each one of these begin their digestion and what enzymes are going to be responsible. So you should know that salivary amylase is produced by the salivary glands in the mouth, pancreatic amylase is produced by the pancreas, and the rest of the digestion occurs in the small intestine. You should know that pepsin is produced by our gastric glands in our stomach, and it's going to break down proteins into peptides, and then our digestion of our protein continues in the small intestine with trypsin and pepsidases. Our nucleic acid digestion begins and ends in the pancreas, or begins and ends in the small intestine with nucleases, which are secreted by the pancreas, and nucleosidases, which are also secreted by the small intestine. I'm less concerned about that. I just want you to know that nucleic acids and fats do not begin their digestion until they reach the small intestine, where they get enzymes from the pancreas in order to break those down. I do want to mention just a few homeostatic imbalances. Sorry about that. I lost my train of thought. I want to mention just a few homeostatic imbalances that are associated with this portion of the digestive system, starting off with lactose intolerance. Lactose is the primary sugar in milk. Lactase is the brush border enzyme that digests that lactose. So this is going to be found inside of the small intestine. It's going to help break down that lactose. An individual who does not have or an individual who is lactose intolerant does not have and is not producing the lactase, the enzyme needed to break lactose down into glucose and galactose. So ultimately, if you are not able to break the sugar down, it's going to be characterized by, or lactose intolerance, it's going to be characterized by diarrhea, gas, bloating, abdominal cramps after ingesting milk and other dairy products. Diarrhea occurs because the undigested lactose causes fluid retention in the small intestine. The gas and bloating and cramps occur when the bacteria break down the lactose anaerobically, meaning that they're going to be fermenting it and producing a lot of gas in both the upper and lower digestive system. Celiac disease is also a homeostatic imbalance of this portion of the digestive system. This is an autoimmune response against a protein called gluten. Gluten is found naturally in grains like wheat, barley, rye. The presence of gluten in the small intestine is going to result in an inflammatory response, which damages the villi and the microvilli of the small intestine. So it can lead to severe damage of your small intestine, which can lead to abdominal pain, diarrhea, and malnutrition. Now, the reason for the malnutrition is because you are damaging your small intestine. When you damage that small intestine, you're not just having a hard time digesting and absorbing carbohydrates, but your body will not be able to absorb the nutrients from the other foods that you are eating. So this is the significant. Celiac disease is a very important and serious disorder. All right, you should be able to describe the functions of the stomach and how the wall of the stomach is modified to perform those functions. Detail the functions of the small intestine, how the wall of the small intestine is modified to perform those functions. And summarize the differences in how carbohydrates, proteins, fats are digested and absorbed by the small intestine.